Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call to order the New York City Audit Committee meeting of Wednesday, March 27th. And I'd like to call upon the secretary to do a roll call.
Good morning, everyone. Public members, Michael Spitzer, Chair.
Present.
Larry and Angelo. Present. Mark Kaplan.
Present.
Marsha Van Wagner.
Present.
Our public members, representing Mayor Eric Adams, Paul Timus.
Present.
Representing Comptroller Brad Lander, Jacqueline Thompson.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Point out to everybody, if you're going to speak, press and you have to hold. Okay. Next, I'd like to have a motion to accept the minutes of the Audit Committee meeting of February 28th, 2024.
So moved.
Okay, good, thank you.
Mike, as usual, I have some little things, so.
Okay, we'll give him over to Kat. Next item up on the agenda is the financial statements and management letters and first up is the Mayor's Fund to Advance New York City. For those people that are here, please identify yourselves for the purpose of the minutes. And if there's any, your auditors, if they're here, identify them, or if anybody's on the screen, identify them. That's all for the purpose of recording them into the minutes.
Good morning. My name is Camaria Brissot. I'm the Director of Finance and Operations at the Mayor's Fund to Advance New York City.
Good morning. My name is Najma Ali Sherman. I'm Interim Executive Director at the Mayor's Fund.
And good morning. I'm Doug Zimmerman, partner with the FPR Group, the auditors of the fund.
Would you like to make a brief presentation or talk about the financial statements this morning?
I guess I'll cover that part. Again, we audited the financial statements for the year ended June 30th of 2023. We issued an unmodified or clean opinion on those financial statements. Of note, there was a restatement of the 22 financial statements for some accounts payable that had not been properly recorded in the prior year for $148,000. Additionally, of note, in the GAGAS opinion, in the back of the financial statements, you would see a material weakness with regards to the recording of grant revenues and expenditures. And we certainly have been working with management to correct that. That was a repeat finding from a similar finding that was in the June 30th of 2022 financial statements. The fund on a financial statement basis had a loss of $886,000. A portion of that was attributable to investment losses in the primarily the bond fund that the fund maintains, and there have been discussions with management with regards to actions to be taken with regards to a review of the investment portfolio. I'd certainly be happy to answer any questions anyone has.
I have a couple of questions. We've had some other entities in here when we've talked about custodial credit risk, and I think in the audit it noted that there was several $1 million that were exposed to custodial credit risk. Did I read that wrong?
No, there is a footnote on page 13 of the financial statements that indicates that, yes.
So are there plans to mitigate that risk?
Obviously, that would be management that would have to reply to that.
So as we mentioned with our auditor, this is our first year auditing and working for the Mayor's Fund. We are in transition. So we are operating under an interim executive director. The plans will be developed, but at the moment we don't have one.
Okay, thanks. And I had a couple of other questions.
Excuse me, I don't interrupt you, but I would like to have a little more conversation about what you just said. I'm accustomed to seeing either secured bank loan, where you have money in a bank, you either have collateralized, or there's a statement that the management is constantly monitoring the financial condition of the bank in which the money resides. Is that latter statement possible here, or you just have it in the bank?
Are you referring to the investments account?
No, you have your concentration of credit risk of $3 or $4 million, which means you have money on deposit at financial institutions that's not collateralized. And I'm accustomed to seeing something, an expression of the fact that management monitors the credit risk of the banks, or it doesn't.
Yeah, he's referring to page 9 has the cash and equivalents of $3.9 million, and then note 2E on page 13.
Yeah, that's correct. I'm sorry, this is my pet peeve.
Yes, there are plans to move our cash that's sitting in our general checking account. There's plans to move it to a money market account with our investment bank. We are onboarding a new treasurer at the moment, and we need their approval. So as soon as that happens within the coming weeks,
Let
the
me
funds
just
will
say
be
this, in the
transferred.
world in which I live, if you had this kind of exposure, you'd get help from the shareholders. And I don't understand why it takes more than one phone call to move this to an institution, or at least tell us what the nature of the institution is that now holds the balance.
And you're absolutely right, Chairman. It does take one phone call. But with our bylaws and protocols in place, we do need approval from the board and the treasurer. So we were waiting for that to come to fruition before we could move forward.
Again, I don't live in this world that you live in. I live in the public company world. This would be inexcusable. And you get a lot of criticism from the shareholders. I don't know why it takes more. You don't need a board meeting.
Yeah, so I was looking for a little bit more context for how the fund works in terms of, you raise money for specific agencies and projects, presumably? Is that how it works? So you have a project identified, you go out and raise money for it, and then, I don't know if you get the money up front and spend it down, or how, the money comes in compared to what the project's how the project moves forward. I do see in the notes where you talk about, or where it talks about, some things are just disallowed and that sort of things, like if certain things don't happen, I guess, and you get a disallowance from a grant. But I just wanted to sort of get a sense of that sort of flow between the fundraising and the money out the door. And then as a follow-up question to that, when you get money, as you did with the ERC, that isn't tied to a particular project, how is that money utilized?
So I can address that first part. So just to give you context, the Mayor's Fund does raise money for programs identified by the city. Once the city identifies an initiative or public program, then the Mayor's Fund, our task is to go out and do fundraising from the private sector. So, we have a budget in mind, right, how much the city program needs, and we will go out and fundraise for that. And so we have to secure all the funding up front from the funder, right? Once we secure that funding, right, we enter into a grant agreement with the funder. We receive those funds. Sometimes we receive all the money up front, or it could be over the term of a grant period in several installments, depending on what we've negotiated with the funder. So once we secure the funding, right, those funds are restricted to spend on a specific city program. And then usually in terms of how the funds are spent out, usually it's through some sort of procurement, right? We are contracting with an outside vendor or a CBO on behalf of the city who would perform the work, to carry out that public program. Mayor's Fund would enter into contract with that vendor, and that's how we would spend out those funds we've raised for the benefit of a city program.
What
Okay,
is
so
the
then
account
like
that-
the credit, the ERC credit would just come in as money that's unrestricted, I assume. And so, but that same amount didn't show up as unrestricted in the financials. So I'm wondering what happened to the ERC credit funds that you received?
Well, it was recorded as unrestricted. However, the investment loss this year kind of absorbed all of that. The funds that come into the fund are restricted. Therefore, any investment losses would be considered unrestricted losses, and therefore other unrestricted funds would have to offset that. And that's basically what happened in the 23 fiscal year.
How many people are at the fund?
Currently, there are 9 employees at the fund.
You said that you, through procurements, you hire other entities to do like the work. Who reviews all their expenditures? That, like really a program type of expenditures.
Just to clarify, this is for the vendors you're asking that we contract with. So that would be the city agency who is administering that program, right? The Mayor's Fund enters into a contract with a vendor, and there's a city office or agency identified in the contract. They are the administrator for the contract and responsible with working with that vendor in terms of overseeing that implementation and how the funds are spent.
So in a sense, you're doing this on behalf of city agencies.
Correct, yes.
I have a couple of more questions. On page 6, the total expenses come down $9.1 million year on year. That's an enormous percentage decrease. What happened?
Well, again, you'd also see an offset of a decrease in revenue. So as projects from one year to the next are either larger or smaller, again, most of the funding is restricted, so it can vary greatly from one year to the next. I think you'd see that revenues and expenses were down basically consistently on both sides.
Okay, then take a look at the net position, unrestricted. How can you have a negative net position?
Again, that is a result of the investment losses that were occurred. The fund had invested in bond funds several years ago, and obviously with a rise in interest rate, that caused those funds to decrease. And we've had conversations with management with regards to that investment portfolio. However, obviously that would be the fund's management to address the placement of those investments. But that unrestricted loss is effectively a result of the loss on the investment portfolio.
I see. Well, I couldn't get that out of this. Then you have on page 7 a non-operating revenue and expense, which varies substantially year on year. What's that? Goes from a negative 681 to a positive 1 million.
I'm sorry, we're on page 6, page 7?
Page 7, next to last line.
I mean, that would be detailed in on page 10. Page 7 is just the MD&A that gives a summarized accounting of that. So on page 10 is the detail of that loss last year of $681,000 and the income of revenues of 1.3 in the current year. And as you can see, the City of New York contract number remained consistent at 700,000. The ERC number is in there for $492,000. And then you can see the big change in the investment loss. Most of the impact of the rising interest rates occurred in the 22 fiscal year. So there was a loss in the portfolio of $1.5 million last year versus a loss of $421,000 in the current year.
Just keep going for a minute if you don't mind. On page 11, there's receipts from employee retention credits. What?
That's the ERC, the Employee Retention Credit. The trust filed for that. With regards to that was a portion of the ARPA, the stimulus law that was passed back in, I think it was 2021. And so they filed an application for, it's effectively a refund of employment taxes that's filed with the IRS. And so the fund undertook the filing of that. It was filed and received.
Well, it was some little bits.
I have a follow-up question on that.
This is,
For the record, just noting that our representative for the public advocate, Wesley Paisley, is on the Zoom call.
Thank you, Katrina. I think that was Katrina. So good morning, everyone. Yeah, about that, you said, so this is a retention, the employee retention credit was under a refund for IRS on employee taxes. Could you also speak on page 21 note about the employee retention credit that is under the CARES Act? I'm just kind of curious how that will come into play with what you just stated before. I think it's note number 8, page 21. Thank you.
Yeah, note number 8 just expands on the amount on the income statement that the fund did apply for and received the $492,000. The CARES Act is the act that was passed by Congress that authorized the ERC portion of that act. So businesses, if they qualified, could file for those refunds. So I don't know if you have a further question with regards to that.
Not at this time. I just wanted more clarification based on your statement. Thank you.
in regards.
Yeah, hi. I just had 2 questions for you. One is most of this work is carried out by contractors, correct? Do those contracts go through the same process as city contracts? Do they go to the controller for review? That's the first question. Second question, as you said, it is as sort of as the city decides. What's the process for the city to decide?
So in terms of the contract and the process, since the Mayor's Fund is a nonprofit, we are not a city entity, so we do not follow the city procurement rules. The Mayor's Fund has its own procurement rules. It's somewhat modeled on the city procurement process, but much more streamlined. So it does not require registration with a comptroller. However, all contracts do need to be reviewed by the New York City Corporation Council. They give final approval to those contracts since these contracts are for the benefit of city programs. And I'm sorry, the second question was about how.
Yeah, how does the city decide? I mean, who decides? The mayor, the agencies? Is the city council involved?
Yeah, sure. So I think, overall, each mayoral administration, they set their strategic priorities. And so I think, usually it's city agencies who have their own priorities, which are aligned with the mayoral priorities for the administration. And so, it is usually the city agency coming to us, identifying a program. The Mayor's Fund does have discretion, right, whether we think it is an appropriate program that for the Mayor's Fund to fundraise for. One of the factors is whether it is aligned with this administration's overall priorities.
Okay, so your institution or agency makes the decision.
We are part of that decision. Ultimately, the mayor's office, City Hall, right? They have final authority, and so we do take that into consideration. But yes, I would say we consult with the mayoral administration and we make that decision.
But you don't include the council?
No, we do not.
And have you ever thought that it might be a good idea to have the contracts reviewed, if not accepted or rejected, but reviewed at the controller's office?
It's not something we've considered. It would, we're not sure it'd be appropriate to give the comptroller, that authority over, a contract where neither party is the city of New York, right? It's for the benefit of a city program.
No, I mean, I wasn't suggesting authority. I was just suggesting review.
That's not something we have considered.
I'd like to talk about the material weakness, because the first sentence, or it says, it almost sounds like these grants are being recorded on a cash basis.
Yeah, when, prior to us performing the audit test work, the grant internally is being maintained basically on a cash basis. However, obviously, generally accepted accounting principles require that the financial statements be recorded on an accrual basis, matching up the revenues and expenditures. So there are adjustments that are recorded, and again, that's why the material weakness finding is there.
So it's only at the end of the year when you're booking the receivables and the allowance?
Correct.
Okay. I'd like to now address like that as a comment that's been here for 2 consecutive years. So is that being addressed in the 24 year?
Short answer, yes, it is being addressed. I should also mention, just to add some color to this conversation, I joined the fund in October and have been working with staff and the auditors to rectify those weaknesses. We have put plans in place and have begun accrual accounting dating back to the beginning of FY24, rather than waiting for the end of the year.
Thank you. Are there any other comments, questions? Move the mic closer to you.
Well,
Not me.
you have a board, right?
Yes, that is
Who
correct.
designates that board?
It is the mayor who selects appointees for the board.
Okay. And they are active in supervising the investments?
We are, as a team, as a management team, we are actively supervising the investments. The board recently onboarded a new treasurer, and so we will begin holding regular audit committee meetings quarterly. As stated in the management response letter, there is a plan in place to monitor and try and improve the performance in our investments accounts.
Well, it's the whole issue of governance is, at least to me, is troublesome here. I can't get the sense of who's responsible for deciding to make an investment, for example.
Well, the
I mean,
bylaws,
with the cash, I mean, in your basic business.
I'm sorry, state that last part again?
There are 2 different investments. One, what do you do with the cash? And the other one is, what do you do to decide to take on a project that's part of your responsibility? What process does that go through internally?
So we are currently developing processes to address those issues. We do need better monitoring of our investment accounts, and this year, with me joining the team, with our new treasurer, there is a plan to put that in place.
Well, I was trying to get beyond monitoring, but who works on the development of how you're going to invest your money in the basic business of the enterprise, not the investments of surplus cash?
I understand. So we are going to be working closely with our fund managers at Alliance Bernstein, together with myself, our treasurer, the board, the executive director when one is hired, and with our partners at Alliance Bernstein to make those investment decisions.
Alliance Bernstein, well, that's the investment in marketable securities. I'm talking about I come in and I say I need $500,000 to do something that's in accordance with what the city wants. Who makes the decision as to whether I'm the proper place to put that money?
The bylaws bound us to the board makes that decision. It does not fall within management, although they do consult with us.
Yeah, just to go back to the contracting issue, are those contractors, is that public knowledge? I mean, when you assign a contract to some organization to carry out some program or policy, is that public knowledge? Is that published somewhere?
You know, it is public information. It's not something that we keep private or confidential. You know, I don't know if there is a central repository, right, where you can see all the mayor's fund contracts. I don't know of any where you could see that in one place, but it's certainly not something we keep confidential.
And I just got one more clarifying question, which is, so we clearly have questions about the governance, some of these governance weaknesses. this fund has been in existence for how many years?
I believe since 1994.
So all of the things that we're raising here have been a problem for the last 30 years? Is that the case? Like the cash accounting and the, other sort of gaps in the governance?
As I mentioned, I joined the team in October of 2023, and prior to me joining the team, there was cash accounting. I don't know if it goes back to 1994. However, for the last few years, it has been, and it is something that I came in and I saw right away and addressed with the auditors, with management, with the board, and so we are putting things in place to rectify that.
And we've only been the auditors for 22 and 23, and it's obviously been a material weakness comment of our firm for those 2 years.
They might have been in existence since '94, but maybe Jackie might know. They've only been part of the city's annual report for maybe the last several years, and that's a big thing in turning this whole thing around. Like them, coming before us has started to change this thing. So kudos for making that effort. But do you have an audit committee?
I believe at the last board meeting, yes, the short answer is yes, we do have an audit committee. And again, we're onboarding the new treasurer who will be the chair of that audit committee.
So it'll just be inside people make up the audit committee, any external people?
I'm sorry, can you rephrase that?
An audit committee made up of just inside people, people that basically work for the fund.
No, the audit committee is comprised of board members, and that's it. And then I join as a visiting member for meetings.
If there's no other questions, I'd like to thank you for coming this morning, and
Yep,
good luck.
got a question. Yep, thank you.
Oh, yes.
Hey, so I remember back in 2022, there was a material weakness of succession planning. And then you keep on stating that, you just started a few months. It just seems, and I understand the whole political environment that, we elect mayors, so, every term, etc. What are you guys doing to, in your work, as you have stated, you're going to be working on a lot of documents, are you thinking about a business continuity plan? I ask that because if there's gonna be a new term for new mayor, and if there's gonna be always turnover of staff, especially how you said 9 employees internally, and then you also have vendors, what are you doing to ensure that there's just like a fluid continuity? And this is just basic stuff that compliance people do, but it's one thing I've been hearing in this conversation, but no one has stated explicitly what's the answer to that. Thank you.
That's a great question. It is a question I had myself when I joined the fund, recognizing the high turnover given just our business model as it relates to the administration turnovers. And, we're doing what we can to put things in place so that there is longevity, there is processes and procedures that can live past us so that if there is a turn in administration, the work can continue without being disrupted heavily. I can say emphatically when I joined it was quite a while for me to get access to a lot of our providers and our systems. And so by putting certain processes in place that I'm now developing and implementing, I believe that the Mayor's Fund will be in a better position for turnover and for transition in the future. In the meantime, we are actively working to ensure that we rectify any issues that are currently being experienced.
Thank you. Could you do me one other favor? Could you also follow up with Katrina once you guys start working on that business continuity plan? I say this because this way, when we have another audit meeting year over year, there would be a record, where Katrina could say that, yes, we had a discussion with your predecessors and they worked on a business continuity plan. And so then they'll go like, oh, so there was one, and they could go and find the records and so off. So Yeah. Oh, yeah, I guess if I was there, I'd point to Katrina for you, but I can't. But the,
Katrina is the
I waved.
audit committee secretary, and once you distribute it to Katrina, she will forward it to all the members of the committee.
Mike, just to get back to what you mentioned, and I don't know, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but back in August, we were instructed that the Audit and Finance Committee members are Bill Heinzman, who represents City Hall, Don Pinnock, who's a commissioner of DCAS, and Lorraine Cortez Vasquez. Those were the members of the Audit and Finance Committee back in August.
Thanks, Jack.
thank you.
Okay, once again, we'll try this. Thank you for coming this morning, and good luck.
Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Next up on the agenda is the New York City tax liens. Good morning. I don't know who's going to lead, but could you identify yourselves for the record, including your auditor and everybody that's with you, and possibly anybody that's on Zoom?
Sorry. Hi, Manhan Chung, OMB. Joining me from OMB is Laura. She's on Zoom.
Hi, Crystal Dong, manager at Mayor Hoffman McCann. We compile the financial statements.
Doug Zimmerman, partner with the FPR Group, auditors for the trust.
Tom Gallagher, RESF Advisors, Program Manager for the Tax Lien Trusts.
Man, you want to give an overview for the trust? Are you going to go through each individual one or just highlight them? I'm giving you an out.
I could just give I'll just give an overview. So, during 2023, one of the trusts all the assets and liabilities were transferred over back to the 1998 trust. That was the 2019 trust. There were no new offerings in 2023. For 2021, total assets for the 2021 trust was $56 million, which is a decrease of $57 million to $47 million from 2022. Total liabilities in that position was $56 million. Is there any questions that specific? Sorry.
There's some new members of the audit committee, so can you give an overview for what is sold for the trust? I know it's the property taxes and water. So, just so that people are aware of what's being sold, the workings of once you sell it, how does the money come to the city, et cetera?
Sure. The tax lien trusts are primarily the enforcement vehicle for delinquent property, real property tax collection, and water and sewer charges. The city had a law, collection law, which now is currently sunsetted. But essentially, properties have, depending on their tax class and assessment, have a certain eligibility requirement. They have to have delinquent charges that are of a sufficient amount and for a sufficient age. For instance, for tax class 1 properties, people have to owe at least $5,000 in property taxes for at least 3 years to be eligible for sale. The city has an elaborate pre-sale sort of noticing process where properties have to be noticed 120, 90, 60, 30, and 10 days prior to a sale. When they have a sale, the city creates a special purpose Delaware trust. It sells the liens to the trust. The trust purchases the liens from the city by entering into the capital markets. It raises money from bondholders essentially, and then those bond proceeds are used to pay the city for the liens. The trust then has servicers, collection agents to go out and notice property owners and try to collect that debt. Ultimately, if taxpayers don't voluntarily redeem those liens or enter into payment plans with the trust, there are foreclosure proceedings which occur against those properties. So this is sort of the city's property tax enforcement mechanism. Every sale that it does, it creates a new vehicle, a new special purpose vehicle, a new trust. And then when those bonds are paid off, any remaining collateral gets consolidated into what I call the residual trust, or the 1998-2 trust, which has obviously been in existence since 1998. And that trust is sort of the repository of all those residual assets. As those assets generate cash flow from collections, those funds are earmarked back to the city, both the city and the water board.
That is the reason predominantly why there's no financial statements from 1999 up to 2018. All those trusts have been closed out.
That's correct.
Yeah. It was once referred to here as the graveyard trust.
Yes, that's sort of internally what it's called. I try to call it the residual trust. It's a little bit less dark, let's say.
Anybody have any questions about these trusts? These trusts are beneficial for the city.
I have a question. Hi, I'm the Executive Deputy Comptroller. I have a question for Tom. Do you foresee any operational difficulties in restarting the program or managing the program should the authorization to conduct lien sale be reinstated by the council?
No, I think the current service providers that provide the program are easily able to scale up. I think we've retained during this pause, we've retained the sort of what I'll call the institutional knowledge of the people to kind of execute the sale. So I don't perceive any problems in sort of reauthor or going forward with a new sale upon reauthorization.
The 21 trust is the latest one, yes? When do you
Yes.
expect that to be closed?
I expect it to be enclosed probably by August, might be my guess. There's about $8 million in bonds currently outstanding. There are quarterly bond payments. I think there's one in May and then in August. So I assume by August, the 21A bonds will be retired.
Has there been any progress, this is for OMB, in the reauthorization of the tax lien program?
I don't know if I could speak to it, but we'll get confirmation and we'll get an answer back to Katrina.
I'm wondering, because I remember back the first time this was authorized. Can you, just for the record, tell us how many or what percentage of Class 1 properties that started at some point in arrears actually got, how many of them lost their homes? What percentage and how many?
So I would say the city notices approximately, I would say, in excess of 15,000 tax class 1 properties in the beginning of the sale process. I would say only about 2,000 of those actually usually get sold in a typical sale. And then typically in the overall portfolio, about 2% of that sale balance winds up going to the full sort of foreclosure liquidation process. So I would say maybe 40 to 50 of those properties it would be my estimate. And that doesn't include, all class 1 is not just residential occupied, it also includes vacant land. So I would say that from a funnel point of view, anyone who loses their home is too many. But I would say that the overall number is fairly low, given the overall numbers of people who start out with a delinquency.
So you're basically saying 40 to 50 properties, many of which are abandoned.
Well, I don't want to say they're all, we don't really do a microanalysis of what they are. I'm just saying is that I don't want tax class one people to think all tax class one are single family occupied properties. There's a variety of properties in tax class one. So I don't want to I don't want to create any kind of like false, description there, but I just do want to say tax class one is still a fairly diverse group of properties.
There's a reference here to environmentally challenged tax liens. Does that mean it's the property that's the environmental, not the tax lien?
That's correct.
Could you repeat that? I just missed that. Thank you.
And then there's another thing, the uncollectible tax liens, and it's 600 odd thousand million dollars. As a percentage of what the revenue is, what is that number offhand?
And for which trust you're talking about? The 982 trust.
The one that caught my eye is the 1998-2 trust, and it's referenced on page 13.
Right. So what you'll see is there's a nominal balance. These tax liens, particularly on commercial properties, there's a high interest accrual. So what happens is on the most distressed properties, which are, some of them are on brownfield properties, which are very difficult to resolve. You'll see there's a huge sort of write-off on doubtful accounts.
Yes.
Right. So, which basically means that the lien balances on those properties far exceed the actual underlying value of the property. So basically, it's sort of like a dead balance. It's an uncollectible balance. It's accrued on, just the tax liens have accrued that balance, but that money is not collectible.
Well, then you don't try to take over the title to the property to which the tax lien attaches.
Well, there's a process by which, when we do a foreclosure, the court authorizes a sale at auction. The trusts generally try to avoid taking any title to any property. So the sale of the property is organized by the court at an auction. For brownfield properties in particular, you'll have, or any property with title problems, you'll have difficulty in liquidating those at auction because there are no real available buyers in that sense.
Okay.
I'm a little flabbergasted that in New York City, but I get it. There are still some properties that, ensuring who the owner is kind of difficult. But in New York City, I'm shocked. Like, I understand like rural suburbs and so off, but yeah. Okay. But so maybe this may be outside the scope, but is there a significant amount of properties out there where it's just not financially prudent to resolve that property, meaning that either to go to the courts to get its title or to sell it and it'll be at a loss? I'm just curious. So, because it just seems like there's what you're saying, the narrative is leading to that there's a few properties out there that are just out there that are environmentally unattainable or habitable, but also financially not worthwhile for most people to take in.
Yeah, I think what you got to think of is the city has over 1 million properties, right? And so we deal with probably the most distressed cohort of those properties. And then of those, we resolve, the overwhelming majority of those. And then at the very, very sort of what I'll call the last to sort of resolve are your most difficult properties with your most unique challenges. So, I mean, I could describe some of them for you. They have colorful stories, but essentially in any large sort of universe of things, you're going to get some unique circumstances which make it very difficult, despite all the efforts to resolve those. I will say the trust makes a simple financial decision because we're a tax enforcement program for the city. We're not like an investment fund. So we will enforce against any property where the cost, we can at least recoup the cost of enforcement. So if we can sort of recoup the cost of enforcement in $1, we're going to enforce against that property because the city wants all properties to be enforced under the same program, regardless of, you know, the underlying economics of the property.
But I was a little unclear from your previous answer about, so those properties that fall out the bottom of this process, do they end up back owned by the city, or are they in some kind of weird purgatory for, you know, bad real estate?
No, the property never gets switched to the ownership of the city unless we were to sort of get foreclosure judgment and the city were to specifically ask for title to that property. So in cases where properties are sort of struggling in this because they have whatever underlying issue there is, they are sort of owned by the prior owner. So, or no, I wouldn't say the prior owner, the current owner who has tax delinquencies. There are some issues, for instance, with title disputes and you know, there's a whole sort of each story has its own, each property has its own unique story, but those few are, they're just sort of what you find in any real estate issue, you know, that they're just, they're problems that are very difficult to solve, and we'll continue to try to solve as many as we can.
And
So
I'm
same
not.
owner,
Oh, no, I was. You go ahead. It's a comment.
okay. So the same owners who can't pay the property taxes continue to own and not pay the property taxes on those properties. This is basically, that's kind of the bottom of the barrel.
Yes, I mean, essentially, if you have like, for instance, if you have a property that was a former industrial site that is significantly contaminated, the business is probably no longer functioning. The corporation that owned it is defunct. There's underlying contamination. No third party wants to buy the property. No one's paying taxes on it. There has to be some kind of change in those underlying facts for there to be a market for that property to change hands. And the trust doesn't want to take title to that property and or any kind of liability, nor does the city. So for those, sometimes, for instance, we had a group of about 12 to 15 brownfield properties. We've resolved about 10 of them. They take some time. Sometimes the state will do some cleanup efforts. We'll have to wait for that process to be completed. And then therefore the property becomes developable again. And then we can proceed with our foreclosure and liquidate it. But that could take 10 or 12 years for that process to complete.
So yeah, I just want to add a comment to that. No, I understand because but from my perspective, what we see is that these properties become a blight for the owners, the residents who live around these properties. And I know in DC, they're trying right now to find a way to give a corporate incentive so that, and I'm not saying all corporates are the best applicants for this, but which they would purchase these properties in order and reduce the liability potentially when they get these properties for like torts, and that they would rehabilitate it. Now, I'm not saying that's the only solution, but but there are many other opportunities. But it would just be nice to know like what's the plan of these properties, because it's just a shame that the people who live around them, their houses become affected, their values go down, their health goes down. It's kind of a cycle of just deplorables, you know. But that's just a comment. That's all.
Well, seeing there's no other comments or questions, thanks for coming this morning.
Duly noted. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for coming.
The next item on the agenda is the New York City water and sewer system. These are all the O and B entities.
Hold this. Good morning. All right, so I'll do a quick introduction of everyone involved in the New York water and sewer system. My name is Raymond Lee. I'm the controller for New York Water, and I'll let everyone else introduce themselves.
David Womack.
Please, when you're speaking, keep your finger down on the push button. and point the mic closer to you.
David Womack, Chief Executive Officer of New York City Municipal Water Finance Authority.
Joe Murin, Chief Financial Officer for New York City Department of Environmental Protection and Executive Director of the New York City Water Board.
Phil Wasserman, Executive Director of the Authority.
Namika Sharma, Deputy Controller for the Water Finance Authority.
Good morning. Omar Nazem, Treasurer of the New York City Water Board.
And Nick Lazzarillo, Audit Partner from Grant Thornton.
Right, so I'll start with a quick introduction of the New York water system. Closer. So I'll start with a quick introduction of the New York City water and sewer system and go through some financial highlights for the fiscal year ended fiscal 2023. So the New York water and sewer system is comprised of the New York City Municipal Water Finance Authority and the New York City Water Board. Collectively, this entity finances and operates via Department of Environmental Protection, the city's water system. I'll start with the highlights for the financials on the revenues on page 20. Overall, the system's revenue increased by $450 million in fiscal 23 compared to fiscal 22. Of that, water and sewer operating revenues increased by $324 million. The increase reflects primarily the 4.9% rate increase for fiscal year 23 on the water rates, along with an overall increase in water consumption in fiscal year 23. Non-operating revenues increased by $128 million compared to fiscal 22, and that was primarily due to increased investment earnings compared to 22. On the expenditure side on page 20, the system's overall expenses increased by $438 million compared to fiscal 22. Of that, operations and maintenance expenses increased by $135 million, primarily due to the city's collective bargaining settlements with DC 37 and an increase in the fringe benefits. Other operating expenses increased by $75 million, primarily due to increases in program expenses, pollution remediation expenses, and expenses related to the system's filtration avoidance determination. Interest expense increased $112 million compared to fiscal 22 due to new issuance of bonds and higher interest costs overall. On the balance sheet side on page 16 to 17, restricted cash and cash equivalents and investments at the end of 23 were about $3 billion, $400 million higher than fiscal 22. Total capital assets net of depreciation increased by $497 million. This is a net result of addition to the construction work in progress and the recognition of $1 billion of depreciation expense. In fiscal year 2023, the authority issued $2.4 billion in bonds, of which $1.8 billion was used for refunding and $600 million of which were new money bonds. The authority also issued $367 million in refunding bonds and $538 million in new money to the state EFC, the environmental ECF, right? ECF, the Environmental Facilities Corporation. Overall, the authority was able to reimburse $1.7 billion to the city for construction costs, while the refunding transactions resulted in gross present value savings of $200 million. That covers the financial highlights. I don't know if Grant Thornton has anything to say before I turn over to questions.
Just that we presented to the audit committee in October. We presented an unmodified or clean opinion. There were no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies noted, no going concern issues, and we had the full cooperation of the management team throughout the audit process.
So throw it over to actually Joe, if you have any comments before we turn over to questions.
Just to add to what Raymond said, I mean, it was fairly, fiducially responsible and successful year for the system with good revenue collections. I would point out that we did have amnesty, which we could talk to more about, which helped, increase revenues. I think that was all I had to say for now, and just welcome the questions from the committee.
Several things. To start off with, the Grant Thornton letter has some constraint on where this information is available. You know that you can't have that. This is a public hearing. So I guess you guys should look at whether or not that sentence has any relevance here.
We can take a look at it.
Let me say this. This is a public hearing, and this document says we can't show it to the public. I don't think that's fair to even put it in there and think about it.
Okay, we can revisit that. That language is directed from professional standards, so I just have to take a look at how it's worded and ensure that it's in compliance with our professional standards, but also in lieu of your comment.
I'd also like to echo his statement too. Thank you.
Let's go back to something else, the custodial credit risk. This is an awful lot of money to have uninsured or uncollateralized.
You're referring to the cash balance at the end of the year. The $12 million is the cash on hand from the New York City Water Board for the last day's collection for the year. And the New York City Water Board bank accounts for the local water fund are collateralized, just a note there.
You don't say that in the footnote, though.
Yeah, I realize that, so we'll clarify that in future financials.
I look at the water. So I understand you're talking about $1 billion worth of fixing of the Ashokan. Is that still true? This is parochial, that question, though.
Yes, we're still proceeding apace with that. It's scheduled for in the coming years, I think starting in like 27, 28, fiscal years 27, 28 to start the design. Because we have a number of other initiatives that we're going through right now, which related to the Kensco system on the east of the Hudson. But we are going to be getting to the Ashokan as well.
By that time, it'll cost more money.
We'll be ready for it.
Can you just go briefly into the amnesty?
Sure, I'll start, and I think if need be, Yelbar, you could pop in as well. But we offered, as you know, we've had a growing accounts receivable balance, mainly, long term, and it sort of spiked as well with the pandemic. So we entered, and we had done this, I think, maybe back in the early 2000s. It was an opportunity for people that had longstanding outstanding accounts receivable be able to come in and make an arrangement to be able to, get current with their accounts receivable. And in doing that, we gave them a discount on their interest rate. So if they paid 100% of the base balance, they were forgiven all of their interest. And then if they gave certain percentage there, and this is, I'll turn to Omar, they were given a lesser amount from there. So Omar, I'm going to expand a little on that.
It was done on a sliding scale basis, so customers who came forward and paid the full amount of their account balance received that full 100% waiver of their late payment charges that Joe described. If they paid a proportion of that, if they paid only 50% of their balance, they received a 75% reduction in late interest. And if they paid only 25% of their balance, they received a 50% reduction in the late interest. So it was done on a sliding scale basis. The program in total generated $105 million of additional revenue receipts as customers made those down payments as a quid pro quo for receiving the interest rate reduction. And in exchange for making the $105 million of payments, they received $22 million in late interest rate reductions as part of the overall affordability purpose of the program.
And I would add that, that has been, in lieu of us having the opportunity to have lien sales in a number of years. So it was very successful in our estimation, and we're continuing to pursue other measures to enhance collections.
So what percentage of the outstanding debts did that resolve, the amnesty?
Right. We probably have a balance of that's going between $1 billion to $1.2 billion in accounts receivable. So that took out about, 10, as Omar just indicated, just about 10%. But we continue to see, that as time goes by, some of our most recalcitrant accounts are not staying current. And that's where we're also pursuing currently, and I don't know if people saw the news last week where the mayor did a shut-off notice at one of a large hotel in Midtown or in the Chelsea district. So we're looking to do shut-offs both on commercial and residential properties as well to enhance our collection measures.
Okay, if I can go on. How can operating revenues be part of bad debt expense? That's the top of page 6. Just the language seems awkward. I understand the first part of it, but bad debt expense is not a part of operating revenues.
Well, the bad debt is against the collections, which are part of the operating expenses.
All right, that's what you want. And then when you get to non-operating expense again, there's a capital distribution referred to on page 8. What does that consist of and why? It's on the top of page 8.
Are you referring to the capital distribution that increased by $124 million?
I'm only talking that non-operating revenue comprise capital distribution. I don't understand how revenue can comprise a distribution. May just be a language issue, but it doesn't make sense to me.
Are you saying non-operating revenue? It is a non-operating expense.
I'm saying non-operating expenses are comprised of capital distribution. Sentence says. But it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that.
So part of the financial reports, we have the filtration avoidance determination, which is to ensure, the integrity of the upstate water systems. We have the option or the ability for those that are to use bond proceeds to be able to go and pay for some of those expenses. Because they are not, in many instances, they are considered capital, but they're, then written off directly to the statements during the course of the financial close.
I'm sorry, can you just repeat that, because I didn't quite understand?
Sure. So, one of the things that this was a determination made, I think, many years ago about when we instituted the FAD, because these are often, and I could clarify, so I'm glad you asked, Lauren, where we're in these instances making payments to entities other than for what would be construed city assets. So we would have with our upstate partners such as stream management, the septic program, we're paying for capital improvements that are not capital improvements to city assets, but they are improvements to, the protection of the watershed system. So those septic systems where we put those into a private home, where people sign up in the watershed to be able to do that, they could be, 10, 50, 100,000. We're doing those in those at-risk areas of being able to leachate into the water system. Same thing with stream management. We're trying to make sure that we're going to make sure the integrity of the runoff is going to be properly captured and, filtered when it gets to the system there. So those expenditures, which we do with upstate partners, such as the Watershed Agricultural Committee and the Catskill Watershed Commission, or committee, I should say, we pay them and we use capital proceeds to be able to pay those. But then when we do the close on the financial statements, those are, we use bond proceeds, but they are, a write-off within the financial statements from there.
Okay, so if I understand, so you're paying to fix the things that surround the water supply to keep the water supply safe and clean, et cetera, and you can do that using city money?
Yes, we can. I mean, we're using the proceeds, the bond proceeds, from there, as it's just been more expedient because we do consider it a improvement to the overall health of the watershed.
But it's authority bonds,
Yes, they are.
not city bonds.
Yes, all water, water authority bonds, not city bonds.
Did I raise the question with you about your custodial credit risk on the dollars?
Yes.
Yes.
Dan, can you hear us?
Yep, I can
Dan.
hear you now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mikhail.
Great, thank you. So we conducted the audit of HYIC for June 30, 2023 financial statements in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards and government auditing standards. We issued a clean or unmodified report. We had no material weaknesses over internal controls, and we had no material findings in terms of compliance that would relate to the financial statements. Management of HYIC was extremely cooperative, and we appreciate everyone's help during the audit.
Does anybody have any questions or comments? Even the okay, thank you for coming then. Before, thanks again for coming.
It's the same cast and crew for the rest of these, so. So is TFA or TSAS next? TFA, okay. All right.
Usual comment I just caught. The business won't let us show it to anybody. Come on, guys, get at it.
Noted.
All right, so moving on to the Transitional Finance Authority. I'm Raymond Lee. I'm the controller for the TFA.
David Womack, President of TFA.
Kenny Noreen, Deputy Controller, TFA.
Phil Marciano, Meyer Hoffman McCann, shareholder for the audit of TFA.
And then, as before, Dan Malcolby with Meyer Hoffman McCann, and also Laura Neasley of TFA. All right, so starting with a brief description of what the TFA does. The TFA issues bonds to finance certain city capital projects using either future tax secured bonds or building aid revenue bonds. So going into the financial highlights for the year. With regards to revenues, TFA collected $17.2 billion of income tax revenue in the fiscal year of 2023, which was an increase of $2.2 billion from the prior year. Of that, TFA retained $1.3 billion of that income tax revenue. TFA also received a $2.2 billion debt service prepayment grant from the City of New York, which was an increase of $201 million from the prior year, and had investment earnings of $55 million, which is an increase of $74 million from the prior year. On the expenditure side, TFA distributed $3.9 billion of capital bond proceeds to the city, which was a decrease of $173 million from the prior year. TFA also paid $1.6 billion of principal and $1.8 billion of interest on the tax secured bonds, and paid $192 million on principal and $370 million of interest on the building aid revenue bonds. From a balance sheet perspective, TFA issued $3.8 million of new money tax secured bonds for capital purposes. It also issued $2.1 billion of tax secured refunding bonds and $564 million of building aid revenue bonds. I'm going to turn over to Dan for any comments before we turn over to questions.
Sure, and similar comments to before, same audit procedures really as the other entities. As of June 30, 2023, our audit was under generally accepted auditing standards and government auditing standards. Our opinion was clean and unmodified. The management letter has no material weaknesses indicated, and yes, Mark Kaplan, I'll just point out the restriction paragraph is there. But I promise you can read it. I won't withhold it. But again, thank you for the cooperation of the staff and management of the Finance Authority.
Hi, I just have a couple of questions. What's our ceiling these days in TFA?
The TFA currently has authorized to issue $13.5 billion that is outside of the city's debt limit. All other bond issuances are included under the constitutional debt limit.
All right, how much of that have we used up?
Oh, we used all of it. TFA has about $47 billion in debt outstanding.
Are you
Jessica?
anticipating any changes to the building aid revenue bond reimbursement formula, or any things coming from the state's end of that agreement?
Laura, do you want to take that? No, she heard it. But I mean, they always do modify slightly, but
Marcia, could you just repeat that question?
Oh, the question was whether they're anticipating any changes to the building aid revenue bond reimbursement agreement going forward.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. No anticipated changes that we've heard from the state.
Francesca?
Thank you. Page 27, I think it says you have TFA has uncollateralized and uninsured deposits. It's sort of a theme today.
we really, TFA doesn't really hold cash balances. Monies typically just go to the city, but we'll review that. And relative to the amount of money that comes into TFA, it's relatively small.
Is it your opinion, is it TFA's opinion that General Municipal Law Section 10 does not apply to TFA?
Didn't say that.
We'll discuss with our council internally on that matter.
And after that discussion?
We'll let you know what the results of the discussions are.
Could you please respond to Kat and she'll distribute it to all the committee members?
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm amused by the language which says personal income tax payable to New York City. I didn't think the city paid any income tax, just language.
So the income tax is paid, all of this city's income tax flows through TFA, and the TFA retains what we need to cover.
Well, I understand it's just the way you say it. Income tax sounds like it's payable by me.
Oh, no. Yeah.
It is. Now, on page 9, you say that, obviously, you're saying that since you plan to hold it to maturity, you don't have to worry about changes in market value, but you do need to worry about custodial risk, right?
Which paragraph are you referring to on page 9?
Last paragraph, you say you expect to hold it to maturity. You don't have a credit. I don't know what. You don't worry about mark-to-markets. I guess that's what that means. But if that bank should go into trouble in the interim, you're uncollateralized. So you have some credit risk there.
Yeah, I think that's disclosed within the financials
that's
too.
in the
That's general credit risk that would occur. But I mean, the mark-to-market is something they have to do for GAAP purposes. But the securities that they're in, I mean, generally they're all government treasury securities. So.
But if you have those securities held in a bank that goes under, you have a credit risk.
Absolutely, and there's disclosure to that in the notes to the financials related to custodial credit. It's not in MD&A, but it's in the notes.
Okay.
DNA only talks about the valuation for GAAP purposes.
Yeah, Mark, it's on page 29, note 4, custodial credit risk. No problem.
Any other questions or comments? I thank you for coming here this morning. You're going to still remain in the same seats?
One more.
Next up is TSAS.
Yep, TSAS. And Raymond Lee, controller of TSAS.
David Womack, president of TSASC.
Kenny Narine, Deputy Controller TSAS.
Phil Marciano, still shareholder, Meyer Hoffman McCann, auditor for TSASC. Actually, I should note for the record, TSASC and TFA were actually signed opinions by Warren Ruppel, the former audit partner. I'm here in place for him and taking over going forward. I didn't say that initially. Dan, you want to introduce yourself? I didn't let you speak on Zoom.
Yeah, Dan Mackley. I'm the senior manager on all three of these accounts, TFA, TSASC, and HYIC.
And then again, we have Laura Neasley on the call, Vice President TSAS. Right, so TSAS, I think formerly known as Tobacco Settlement Securitization Corporation, was primarily created to securitize the city's tobacco settlement revenues. I'm sure most of you are familiar. Many years ago, the various states had settled with the tobacco companies, and tobacco companies to this day continue paying settlement revenue to the states, of which New York City receives a portion of that settlement. In terms of financial highlights, in revenues, TSAS collected $198 million of tobacco settlement revenues, which was $11 million less than the prior fiscal year. This was sufficient to fully fund the scheduled debt service payments and replenish the subordinate liquidity reserve by $59,000. TSAS also had $3.3 million in investment earnings, which was $3.4 million more than the prior fiscal year. On the expenditure side, TSAS transferred $124 million of that tobacco settlement revenue, the unpledged tobacco settlement revenue, to the trust, which was $7 million less than the prior year, and also paid $28 million in bond principal and $48 million in interest in 23. On the balance sheet side, TSAS has $938 million of bonds outstanding as of 6/30/2023. Dan, for any comments before turning over questions?
Sure, I'll just state again, we performed the audit in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards and government auditing standards for June 30, 2023. Again, no material weaknesses reported, and the opinion was unmodified or clean. And again, same cooperation. Appreciate your help.
This is not an accounting question, but I noticed you have an unamortized loss on refunding. Typically, with a refunding, you do it and you pick up some gain. What was the offset to the unamortized loss, and where does that show up?
Can you, what page are you looking at?
Page 13, deferred outflow of resources, unamortized loss on refunding. Normally, you only do a refund when you pick some benefit up, however, and it's 2 or 3 different kinds, bookkeeping and real, but
It would really just depend on the amount of the net carry value of the old bonds that were refunded versus the new bonds that came on. Not necessarily, that doesn't take into account the interest savings or the present value savings that you get out of the refunding, which is disclosed in the financial statements.
Yes. So it might show an accounting loss, but the economic benefit from doing the refunding would still be positive.
it sort of sticks out that way.
That's fair, yeah.
You have an issue of bonds in approximately 7 years. Looking at the footnote, the last year was 2017 for outstanding debt. Am I correct?
Yes.
That's correct.
That's correct.
Anybody have any comments or questions?
I have a curiosity. You haven't drawn down the subordinate reserve in the past 2 years, but you did from 2017 to 2021. Has anything changed? I mean, or you expect that to continue?
Well, I believe for 2021, or 2022, there were actually increased revenues. It was unusual, and investment earnings were higher than were expected, but we don't necessarily expect that to continue.
And that there's a 9.7 million left. What happens if the reserve is exhausted?
If the reserve is exhausted, if the reserve were to be exhausted, there wouldn't be enough to pay the bondholders, and interest would be deferred.
And that would be for the subordinate debt holders.
Just for the subordinate. The senior debt, the senior bondholder seems to be okay.
Does anybody else have any, excuse me, questions or comments?
I do, and I apologize if mine is repetitive. So on page 61, and wait, let me make sure. We're still at New York City Water and Sewer System, correct?
No. We're at the TSAS.
Ah.
We're at 4 from the water.
All right then. I'll just send it to Katrina to email. My apologies. I had a brief hiatus.
All right. Thank you for coming this morning, and good luck.
All right. Thank you, Ron.
Wait, you're leaving?
Oh yeah, that's it for us.
Wait. Please don't take the chairs with you. Next up on the agenda is the Department of Education's management letter. If you're looking that one time this was going to be an executive session, of course it was a draft, but the letter became finalized, and now we're doing it in the open. Please identify yourself for the record and the audit partner that's for this engagement.
Lena Ferrera, Chief Accountant of the DOE.
Desmond White, Strategic Workflow Manager, Department of Ed.
And Scott Strickland, Deputy CIO, Department of Ed.
Mike Ryan, Managing Director with Grant Thornton.
Kevin Morris, Managing Director with GT.
All right, I'll kick this off. So we issued our management letter back in January. We did have a number of findings, all on the IT side. We had a significant deficiency as well as a few control deficiencies. So I'll let Kevin run through, give a high-level summary of those findings, and then please let us know if you have any questions.
Yeah, so to summarize the findings on the IT side, I'll start around the privileged access side. Number one, shared accounts. So we identified a number of shared generic privileged accounts at the database level, where there were a number of folks who were sharing IDs, and this is a risk around accountability. I don't know, do we want to pause for management's response, or should I be working through every one of these first?
So regarding the shared accounts, we are aware of that, and we recognize that it is not a best practice. The current situation that we have is that that is a legacy database structure. We have a plan to migrate that into our new up-to-date database structure, which does not allow the use of shared accounts. We are in the process of allocating resources, identifying the hardware, et cetera, that we're going to need. That is set to begin in the new fiscal year. So hopefully we'll be back here next year. We won't have the shared accounts.
Can I just ask a question? and I'm not an IT specialist, but if two people are sharing an account, do you actually need new software to give one person one account and another person a separate account? Can't you do that without new software?
The problem is that all of the administrative rights that those accounts have are designed around a specific database structure, which is limited. In the new structure, the way we do that, we elevate permissions as needed. So in order to do that and manage those accounts, we have to be able to separate those from the actual database structure.
I'm sorry, I'm still not understanding. If we are sharing an account, and that's not good practice, because it's not good practice, do you actually need to have a whole new system to say, you know, Mark has one account and Larian has another?
Okay, so the shared accounts are actually used by the system as well. So those users have separate accounts to manage, right? We've issued new accounts, but those accounts that were shared or were continued to be shared are going to continue to show up on an audit until we redesign the databases. So in other words, you'll still find those accounts, right? And they'll still be identified as shared accounts, because not only do people use them, the system runs jobs with those accounts.
And you can't change that without an entirely new system?
We could change it, but it represents a significant risk to the purchasing application, or FAMIS, our accounting system. It's the database that supports FAMIS where these accounts are present. So it's not a small task. It's actually much more difficult than people realize. But we have identified it. We understand what needs to be done. We have a way to migrate it. We've identified that as a project in the upcoming fiscal year. We just have not done it yet. So it is identified. We recognize the risk, and we have a plan to migrate away from that.
How long has this issue been around?
It's been around since the development of FAMIS, a while.
Is that like 20 years?
20 plus.
Okay, moving on. The next item is around
Oh,
segregation.
well, I do have a question, follow-up on question on that. So I understand what you're saying. So you're saying that when it the program runs a function, it's gonna even use the shared accounts. What I'm curious is that if there are shared accounts lying around, and yes, you've created new accounts, what are you doing to secure that those legacy shared accounts are not being vulnerable to any outside attacks? Because typically vulnerabilities occur with those shared accounts. Like there's two issues here. There's the first one, the physical problem of two people or more using a shared account, and you can't account for when they're making changes. Is employee A, B, or C? But then there's the outside threat that, let's say there's a shared account that the system is using, no human is using, and an outside attacker can, exploit that vulnerability that there's no human monitoring the account. So I'm just trying to figure out, what are you guys doing to monitor at least those shared accounts until you migrate to a new system?
So all transactions in those systems are recorded and logged, and specifically we've identified those shared accounts, and they're controlled. They're not laying around. They're actually controlled by people we entrust to manage the system. So they are highly protected. They are logged. There is event management for those accounts. So it's not like they're lying around. I don't want to create that impression. The other thing is, externally, you cannot reach the servers to actually use those. So that's a way that we protect those from. There's no public access to those databases directly. It's only internal systems. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, that answers the external one. And you're saying for the internally, there's people actually monitoring those shared accounts, correct?
There's people monitoring the systems, the servers, the databases, and the accounts. Yes, there's a continuous monitoring of all our systems.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Have a great day.
Next item on the list is around segregation of duties, whereby we saw non-IT personnel who had administrative access to both the operating system and the application level.
In management's response, you said that, the DOE will complete this review by the end of the calendar year. What is the status of that?
So we completed the review, and we made a determination that the two projects that we have ongoing, the one for implementation of Secret Server and another one for the implementation of SailPoint, both of those should be wrapping up in the new fiscal year. Once those products are in place, we will begin to automate the management, the assignment and removal of roles. And that in and of itself would alleviate the condition that exists with the previous accounts, the separation of duties. The other piece that we made a decision on already is the reason that we had the delegated access in the first place was we had a distributed model where the support for schools was done by administrative offices outside of IT, and there was a request at that time to delegate the management of those accounts. That model has since been changed, and we've internalized that. So these accounts, even though they're present, they're not being used to actually manage security. So we are going back and we're cleaning up the access of the 8 accounts that were identified. We have not completed that yet, but that's the other piece that we identified.
Based on happy, fortunate personal experience with this kind of a problem, is that when the system gets hit, before you've done the work, all of a sudden the money is found to kind of fix it up rather quickly.
I don't. This is not a new problem, so, right? And there was no significant allocation of money to do this specifically, which is part of the issue. So we're trying our best to wrap it into other ongoing work, other improvements. So rather than go back and fix a legacy database as a project in and of itself, we understand that we're already implementing a better user management system and we just made sure that when we implement that, which is already a funded project, that it incorporated the fix for those legacy issues. So we're doing the best we can to manage through that.
I think the next item relates to what we just spoke about as far as segregation of duties goes, and that was that there was not a formal process in place to monitor the administrative access, given what we had seen around segregation of duties.
So I don't know if there are questions on the last point, but we did reference the 2 systems that we're putting in place: Secret Servers to manage privileged administrative access in the back end. So system administrators, database administrators, that will be managed by Secret Server. And then for user requests to create purchase orders, approve purchase orders, that will be managed by the SailPoint product. And I think we referenced both of those in our response.
Okay, last few items around control deficiencies that we noted given the procedures we performed. The first was around a terminated user, whereby the individual's last day was in January of 2023, and they were removed back on May 15th of the same year. There are no questions on that. I'll move on. The second point was around user access reviews, whereby we saw no formal process in place to review users at the SQL Server level, Active Directory, as well as the Galaxy application.
So in the response, it says you're going to have the process by April, which is coming up. So how is that going?
So as a follow-up for a similar finding last year, we did conduct a manual review of all of the FAMIS access accounts. And the reason we did that was to develop a process to be able to automate. We are repeating that manual process this year again. And then the idea was, once we have that process identified, as we roll out the automation software, that would drive the manual work that we did would drive the business rules that we would use to automate that in the future. So we are going to repeat that manual review based on the process that we did last year. So not only will that cover the annual review for the upcoming year, it'll give us the business cases that we need to put the rules in place to automate moving forward. Galaxy already has automatic provisioning and deprovisioning, so we didn't focus on that as much. FAMIS is the one that typically does not have any automation in terms of being able to remove users automatically, let's say if a person gets terminated. There are a lot of manually driven processes. That's why we focused primarily on FAMIS in terms of the manual review.
Wait, what?
Just as an FYI, Famous is their accounting system, Galaxy is their budgeting system.
I have a quick question. You said something about the you had to manually terminate people when they leave the organization. Could you clarify that for me? That statement?
So when we give a user access, if they leave the DOE, we disable their ID automatically. But if you run a query, that account will still appear as if it has the access. So in other words, my account is dwight2, right? I leave the organization, you can terminate that account so I can't log in anymore. But from an auditing perspective, if you run the report, you will still see that ID, dwight2, still has access to what I previously had. And that is a serious issue, because if that ID gets inadvertently reactivated or I come back to the DOE, I'll have the rights that I previously had. So there's there's a manual piece where you actually have to remove the user ID, not just disable it. You have to remove the access from it in order to show up clean on an audit, right? So that's what that situation is.
So in theory, if an employee got access to, let's say, one database of and then left the organization, came back years later, went into another department, because let's say they did not manually make that change, they'd be access to two databases. And let's say there's a requirement by law that they're not supposed to because of segregation of duties. How would you resolve that?
Again, the manual review that we did was in lieu of automation. So if we're conducting the manual review and we're actually making changes to accounts that don't need to be there, that is to cover the situation where an employee would have left and then might have come back. So as we do the manual review, we're actually removing the access from the accounts, regardless if the person is currently employed or was a former employee. So that literally is the crux of the manual review. And that is the goal of the automation, so that we wouldn't have to do the manual review anymore. So the manual review is actually taking the place until we get automation in place. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, so potentially I could work for the DOE and HR and then leave and then work in another department, still have access to employee social security numbers and stuff like that, or unless the manual review goes well, or is it something more like it's not as serious if the manual review fails?
I don't want to say these are hypothetical databases, so I don't want to just say that everyone has access to social security numbers. So like, let's be clear about that. But in the scenario that you're putting out, if we are running that process, right, to remove access, as long as we remove access from the user ID, it doesn't matter if that employee leaves or comes back. When they try to access that database, they're going to find out that they don't have access, and they're going to have to request it, right? Which is why we want to remove those accounts. That manual review is not the best practice in the world, but it is what we put in place based on a previous finding in a prior year's audit. So we are moving those accounts temporarily as a manual process, and that is the goal of the project that we're implementing the automation system. So I don't know if you have further questions around that, but if we're removing the access from the ID, that is literally what's going to correct the finding on the audit.
So I got a little confused in your last statement. So you're saying that if an employee starts with database one, see, I'm not using the scary words. And then they go to database, they come back later and they get access, well, they come back later into the organization, they'll have access to database 1 and database 2, but for that manual override, right? Is it like automatic or is it the manual override comes in afterwards? Just kind of curious.
So given that FAMIS is the application in scope, let's talk about that, because the scenario you're given makes it seem like it's one or two different databases, right? We only manually cleaned up the FAMIS access piece, right? So we looked at all of the users that have access to FAMIS. We listed out the current permissions that they have. Then we sent that list to each of those people's managers, and we said, do these people need to continue to have the access, or does it need to be changed or removed? The managers responded back, we made the changes. So the current FAMIS structure represents authorized users access at the appropriate levels that those managers authorized. That's the manual cleanup process. If it's another scenario where you're saying here's one database and another one, or a separate application, that doesn't cover what we intended to do.
So
To Grant Thornton, have you reviewed the steps and procedures that they've done, and are you satisfied with them?
We have not yet, but we will certainly do that in the coming months when we look at this again.
So it isn't automatic then. Which I mean, I know you said it wasn't automatic, but I'm just trying to understand the whole process, you know, coming into the
Wes,
organization.
we will get information when Grant
Okay,
Thornton has
thank you.
the opportunity
Apologies. Yeah,
to review that for this fiscal year.
thank you.
Last item we had, as far as the IT side goes, was around passwords, where we saw at the SQL Server database level that password settings were not being forced.
That is related to the same issue with the shared accounts. It's using SQL authentication. As we migrate away from that, we will change that also to our standard Active Directory based authentication as well, which has greater password complexity.
Are there any other questions or comments regarding DOE's management letter? Then I thank you for coming this morning, and good luck with this year's audit.
Thank you.
Next, we're going into executive session. I'd like to take a 5-minute break.
Mikhail, we can pause recording.
I'd like to have a motion to go into executive session.
I move.
Second.
We are now in executive session. Please cut the recording.
Since there's no other items on the agenda for the meeting, I'd like to have a motion to adjourn.
Move adjournment, sir.
Thank you. Everybody have a good holiday.
We can end recording.